Jews have been classic examples of a very similar pattern, and nowhere more so than in the United States, where most arrived in mass from Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, among the poorest of the immigrant groups, settling in grossly overcrowded, squalid, and unsanitary tenements in New York's Lower East Side.
The European Jews came to the States and they met face to face with life in the pit. And so they were poor in money and they had to stay in overcrowded urban living spaces, but they were rich in hard work and strategy.
Their men usually began working as lowly peddlers on the streets, while their women and children worked at home in sweatshop conditions, with sewing machines whirring for long hours in the tenements, doing piecework on garments.
Working long, hard hours, doing laborious work. This was the price that they had to pay and the sacrifice that they had to make. But there's more to their strategy to climb out of the pit than just working hard, as we'll see later on.
In the African nation of Sierra Leone, the Creoles looked down on the Lebanese immigrants because they were uneducated and poor. But the Lebanese did not remain that way long, and then the Creoles' contempt turned to resentment and hostility when the Lebanese became successful in business.
That's under the law of rhythm, where everything has its ups and downs, and so understand that no person or group stays at the top or bottom forever. And so the people who were once at the bottom, they turn the tables, and then eventually they get to experience what it's like to be living on the top, right? As we see right here with the Lebanese, they were killing the game in business. That's what they started doing. And then what happened next? The Creoles, who were looking down on them at first, all of a sudden now, they became hostile and they got mad, right? And so this is a natural human response, and humans from all backgrounds have this potential to get mad, right? When they see other people who are winning in the game. And so now let's go ahead and look at the Lebanese strategy for climbing themselves out of the pit. Here we go.
School-aged children, when not in school, were at the parents' elbows, waiting on customers, making change, stocking shelves, and imbibing the shrewdness of operating an independent business on meager resources. They were inculcated with the parents' work and thrift ethics and the lesson that family unity and self-denial was essential to the family's goals.
School-aged children, when not in school, they weren't hanging out on the streets or spending idle time doing a bunch of nothing. What they were doing is they were at their parents' elbows learning how to conduct business at an early age, right? And in other words, these children, they became carriers of the traits of saving and working hard, right? And so they're getting trained just like parents who go out and train their kids in football and in basketball. These kids here, they're getting trained, and they're getting trained in the areas of work ethic, self-discipline and denial, and learning how to make a business successfully operate with very little resources.
In country after country, successive generations of Lebanese moved up step by step.
Can we see how they moved up step by step? Of course we can. They had a certain mindset and they had a certain approach towards life's problems that allowed them to pull themselves out of the pit.
With the Lebanese, as with the overseas Chinese and the Jews, what mattered was not that they first arrived in various countries as immigrants with very little education, but that they came from a culture which valued education highly, so that once they became financially able to do so, they saw to it that their children acquired higher education and thus could expand the horizons from commerce to the professions such as medicine, law, and science, as many did.
And this was the part of the European Jews' game plan that I said that we would get to earlier. They had a culture that placed a high value on education. And so the money that they earned, what they did with it was they saved it and then they spent it on getting their children educated so that the next generation would have a better starting point in life than what they did and what they had. And so education is a critical component for climbing out of the pit, but it's just not any type of information. You have to have the right type of information. And then you have to make use of that information in the right way, because you can't just be one of these type of people who keep all this information in their head and then they never do anything with it, right? That's super pointless, right? And so it needs to be put to use, which is obviously what these groups did. And so, in fact, when I was in Miami Beach a few weeks ago, it was me and my wife. We were walking down one of the main streets in Miami Beach, and then we kept seeing the Hasidic Jews everywhere. And so you can tell because they dress alike, and so it's not hard to miss them. And so they all lived in this very expensive section of Miami Beach, and it's a whole bunch of them over there, right? And so this is just the results of that generation's work that they put in. And so don't worry, because everyone gets their chance to be on the top, right? And everyone gets their chance to fall down into the pit as well. And so this is the law of rhythm, right? And you can't escape it. And so now let's move over to find out about the Cubans falling into the pit and see how they got out of it. Here we go.
Many Cubans who had been professional and business people in their homeland before Fidel Castro seized control and imposed communism in Cuba fled to the United States, where they were concentrated in nearby Florida. Unable to take much of their physical wealth with them to America, and usually unable to resume the same professions they had back in Cuba, since their Cuban educational or occupational credentials carried no weight in the United States, these refugees found themselves suddenly at the bottom, economically.
The Cuban professionals who fled to Florida were unable to take their credentials or physical wealth with them, and then they suddenly found themselves in the financial pit, right? And so let's go ahead and see what they had to do about it.
As one account put it, they crammed into small apartments and became dishwashers, janitors, and tomato pickers. For the overwhelming majority, the story of their success was one of arduous toil, swallowed pride, and sacrifice for their children. Former executives parked cars, judges washed dishes, doctors delivered newspapers.
You see that? Now imagine coming from the professional fields of being a doctor, a judge, and an executive, and then finding out that in your new reality in America, you now have to park cars, wash dishes, deliver newspapers, and be crammed up with multiple people inside of a small apartment, right? And so imagine how much pride had to be swallowed when faced with this type of circumstance, right? And so this is the pit that we're talking about. And so they had to do whatever they had to do in order to make the sacrifice for the future generations. And so let's see if this paid off. Let's see if we can get some more.
Yet these Cuban refugees who found themselves at the bottom when their exodus began in 1959 had children who, by 1990, earned more than $50,000 a year, twice as frequently as white Americans.
This is what I mean when I say that it only takes a generation to climb completely out of the pit, right? Whether it's the financial pit, the identity pit, the cultural pit, or any other type of pit, right? And so one generation maximum here in the land of opportunity called America, we're seeing the Cubans now climbing out of the pit. And then what are they doing? They're passing the white Americans in certain earning categories. And the truth be told, the white American group, they're not that hard to beat, right? Because what they have is a major chink in their armor, right? And so that group's culture, it isn't group or community oriented. And so they center themselves around being an individual, right? And so this is the Western way of thinking that the black Americans have inherited, which is one of the cultural traits that's going to keep holding them back, right? And so they keep thinking I, and me. And they do that instead of thinking we, right? And you can't have a dominant I mentality if you're going to try to come out of the pit as a group, right? Because it doesn't work that way. So that way of thinking, that thing needs to be dropped, and it has to be replaced with a collective type of thinking, right? And so many ethnic groups in Africa, they have a great community-based outlook on life, right? And they have a lot to teach people in this area. And so what happens is when you get around the right type of people, and then you combine the collective or the community-based type of approach with all the vast amounts of information and knowledge that we have now, then you start putting knowledge into action. Then you have a group that becomes a force to be reckoned with, right? And so this is what the European Jews did. This is what the Lebanese did. You see this with the Chinese, and we also see this with the Cubans, right? And so many other people who climbed out of the pit as a group.
40 years after these Cuban refugees arrived in the United States, the total revenue of Cuban American businesses was greater than the total revenue of the entire nation of Cuba. Similarly, as late as 1994, the 57 million overseas Chinese produced as much wealth as the 1 billion people in China.
Can you see that? Who do you think was primarily supporting these businesses? It was the Cubans, right? And they clearly saw that it was more beneficial to climb out of the pit collectively and not trying to do it as an individual, right? Not trying to climb out as individuals. And so with the individual mindset, what everyone's trying to do is everyone is trying to outdo the other person within the group. And so what it does is it makes people feel like they have to be the center of attention. It makes people feel like they have to have more money than the other person in the group. It feels like they have to look better than the other person in the group, right? And it creates unnecessary competition with the wrong people. And so the Cubans coming together with the right people who had the right mindset and they had the right set of skills, what they were able to do was come to the land of opportunity, and then within 40 years, they were able to make more money than the entire nation of Cuba. How wild is that, right? And then we can look at the Chinese, where you had 57 million people who left their homelands. They were able to make more money than 1 billion people in China, right? And so how amazing is that, right? Great things can be accomplished when you get around the right people with the right mentality. But understand one thing, that many people have to be left behind. Why? That's because many of them are way too stuck in their ways and in their thinking, right? And what they'll do is they'll drag you down into the pit, right? With all that crying and complaining and giving every excuse under the sun on how things can't be done. And if you fall down into that pit with them, then one day when you lift up your eyes and you're 80 and you're 90 years old, you may come to a realization that you've lived your entire life entertaining excuses. And then you'll be stuck with the everlasting tormenting thoughts of regret called coulda, woulda, and shoulda, right? And who wants to experience that, right? And so when getting your mind right, sometimes what you have to do is you have to change the people who you're around, and you also have to change the environment if it doesn't benefit you, right? So let's go ahead and get some more.
Yet again, all this takes us back to the question, what do we mean by environment? If we mean simply the immediate surroundings, then it is hard to see why other groups living in the same immediate surroundings as the Fujian Chinese in New York, and on the whole living at higher economic levels, do not get their children into the city's elite public high schools as often as the Fujianese do. Nor is it obvious why native-born white Americans do not have high incomes as often as Cuban Americans do. If instead we see environment as including the cultural values that led the Fujianese to make extraordinary sacrifices for the education of their children, or Cuban American refugees to make similarly extraordinary efforts to lift their families up from the bottom, then this situation is less puzzling because it's obvious that not all groups have these same cultural imperatives.
So he's saying that it's not only the physical environment that's influencing the success of these groups, because if that were just the case, then how can you explain the Fujianese who get their children into the elite public schools more often than the people living in the same low income area, and even more often than the people living in higher income areas, right? How is that the case if it's just the physical environment? And the way that this is explained is by understanding that they have a difference in cultural values. And when we understand that groups like the Fujianese and the Cuban Americans and the Jews, they place a super high value on education, then it's not a mystery at all, right? Because what's mysterious about people getting good in areas that they highly value, right? There's no mystery in that. And so with the understanding that all groups do not place the same value on education, it is expected that the groups who do place a high value on education, they're going to easily outperform the other groups who do not, right? You see how simple that is?
But while this makes the problem of understanding the success of these extraordinary groups less puzzling, it also makes the task of trying to get other groups to do the same far more daunting.
And there we have it. This is the final phase of freedom, where old things must be done away with to make room for a new reality, right? And so now is the time to climb out of the pit and enter into the free world where life is much better, right? And things make much more sense. And so this is the end of part 4 commentary on the book here, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, written by Dr. Thomas Sowell. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. And my name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on the other side.